Chapter 1. The Red Dust and the Chrome Bumper. The colony of New Orizaba didn't just have a class divide, it had a chronological one. On the spires of the upper rim, the ultra-techs lived in the year 4000, surrounded by hard light furniture, life-extending nanites, and gravity-defying gardens. But down in the basement, where Lane lived, it was 1998 with better batteries. The air in the basement smelled of ozone and fried synth-leveled meat. The miners were coming off shift, their exoskeletons hissing as they depressurized. Lane sat on a rusted crate near the main mag-lev artery, his scuffed skateboard resting against his shins. He was stocky, built like a fire hydrant, with the kind of center of gravity that made him impossible to knock over, a trait that had won him 3 regional Concrete King trophies. He watched the traffic. Conventionals drove combustion hybrids that rattled the teeth, but every now and then, an ultra-tech float would glide down from the spires to collect exotic minerals. "Check the bumper on that sleek silver one," Lane muttered to himself. As a polished chrome aircar slowed for a congestion drone, Lane kicked off. He didn't just ride, he flowed. With a precision born of 1,000 scraped knees, he reached out and grabbed the magnetized rear bumper of the aircar. The sudden jerk nearly dislocated his shoulder, but he tucked into a crouch, his wheels screaming against the hyper-macadam. He was skitchin' at 80 miles per hour, weaving through the exhaust of the future on a plank of old-world maple. It was glorious. It was also illegal. A blue and red pulse flashed behind him. A peacemaker drone had spotted the tagger. Lane tried to kick out and slide into an alley, but a mag tether snared his board. He went down hard, tumbling into the red dust, the silver aircar disappearing into the clouds without ever knowing he was there. Chapter 2. The Judge's Twisted Mercy. The courtroom was cold. Judge Vane sat behind a desk made of real oak, a sign of terrifying wealth. Lane stood there in his bruised glory, holding his snapped skateboard. Vandalism, reckless endangerment, and skitching on a high-caste vehicle, the judge read, his voice bored. "You're guilty, Lane. You know it. It was a clear road, Your Honor," Lane countered. "I wasn't hurting the car. The law says you're a menace." But, the judge leaned forward, a predatory glint in his eye. "The Colonial Military Academy has a quota for conventional integration. Every street rat I send there earns me a tax credit for my new yacht." "Military school?" Lane recoiled. "I'm a skater, not a soldier." "You're a convict, Flubber," the judge sneered, misreading Lane's middle name on the digital docket. "And Flubber Lane is going to learn to march." The transport ship was a melting pot of misery. Lane sat on a cold bench surrounded by kids from every corner of the galaxy. There were avian hybrids from the clouds of Venus, scaled laborers from the Titan mines, and a few high-born ultras who had been sent there for character building, usually after crashing a yacht into a moon. The reception was icy. The ultras looked at Lane's stocky frame and conventional clothes like he was a museum exhibit of a prehistoric peasant. Chapter 3. The Crucible of the Void. Academy life was a brutal mix of high science and low crawling. In Cross-Training 101, they were forced into link squads. Lane was paired with Celine, an ultra-tech girl who could calculate orbital mechanics in her head but didn't know how to tighten a physical bolt. "Why are we learning to manually prime a torpedo?" Celine asked, poking the massive iron casing with a gloved finger. "The AI does that. The AI dies when the power goes out," Lane said, wrenching a valve shut with his bare hands. "My grandpa said, if you can't fix it with a hammer, you don't own it." The exercises were grueling. Spacewalk maneuvers, phonetic coding for emergency comms, and zero-G combat. It was here Lane found his edge. While the ultras struggled with the lack of up and down, Lane treated the vacuum like a giant skate park. He used the walls as quarter pipes, his stocky body tucked into a ball, pulling 360 flips off the bulkhead to slam his training baton into the instructors. They learned to bridge the gap. Lane taught the ultras how to feel the vibrations in a failing engine. The ultras taught Lane how to interface his mind with the ship's survival fields. By graduation, Lane had earned a begrudging respect. He wasn't the smartest or the fastest, but he was the one who kept moving when the tech failed. Chapter 4. The Boredom and the Name. Graduation came with a choice: home to the red dust or the collegiate military. Lane chose the stars. The pay was enough to buy 10,000 skateboards. He was assigned to the heavy freight hauler, Bellows. On his third day, he stood before the commanding officer, a man whose face looked like a topographical map of a bad war. "Name?" the CO barked. Lane stood at attention, his chest out. "Flubber Lane, sir." The bridge fell silent. Someone snickered. "Flubber?" the CO asked, raising an eyebrow. "It's a family name, sir. From the old world." "Right. Report to the torpedo bay, Flubber. You're a loader." For a week, the boredom was soul-crushing. Moving crates. Calibrating magnets. The ultras on board spent their time in virtual reality. Lane spent his time oiling his board and staring out the thick reinforced glass at the infinite black. Chapter 5. The Hole in the World. The alarms didn't sound like bells. They sounded like the ship was screaming. Pirates. They didn't want the ship. They wanted the refined fuel in the hold. A series of photon bursts rocked the Bellows. Lane was in the torpedo bay, hoisting a massive MARK-7 projectile into its cradle, when the world turned inside out. A direct hit from a pirate boarding spike tore a 15-foot jagged maw in the side of the hull. The decompression was instantaneous. Whoosh! Atmospheric vents failed. Survival fields flickered on. Personal bubbles of air and force feedback, as Lane and a dozen other soldiers were sucked out into the void. It was the ultimate nightmare. Space-locked. You don't die instantly. You float in your little bubble, staring at the stars, for a week until the oxygen scrubbers quit. Lane tumbled, the ship shrinking away. Near him, Celine was spinning wildly, her ultra-tech suit malfunctioning, her screams silent in the vacuum. Then, Lane saw it. A MARK-7 torpedo had been sucked out with them. It was drifting 300 yards away, its autopilot deactivated, glowing a dull, menacing red. Chapter 6. The Torpedo Rider. Lane didn't panic. He saw the torpedo as a moving handrail. Using the small thrusters on his suit, he kicked off a piece of floating debris, a classic wall plant. He drifted, arms outstretched. The torpedo was rotating. Every turn seemed to take an hour. Clang! He caught the tail fin. He hauled himself up the cold metal body, his fingers finding the manual override panel he'd learned to fix back in school. He ripped the wires out and hot-wired the gravity drive. Suddenly, the torpedo roared to life. It didn't have a seat. It wasn't meant for passengers. Lane gripped the casing like it was the most dangerous skateboard in the galaxy. He ignited the drive and pushed. He rode the torpedo like a stallion, weaving through the dark. He swung by Celine, grabbing her harness and hauling her onto the back of the missile. One by one, he skitched through the void, picking up the floating soldiers until 7 people were clinging to the back of a live weapon. The pirates were closing in. Their ships were sleek, fast, and confused. They saw a torpedo moving in a non-linear, erratic trajectory. It wasn't homing, it was carving. Lane was using his center of gravity to tilt the missile, pulling hard ollies over incoming laser fire. The distraction worked. The Bellows crew used the opening to stabilize their turrets and unleash a barrage that sent the pirates reeling. Chapter 7. The Final Risk. Lane pulled the torpedo into the flight bay, the heavy mag curtains hissing shut behind them. The survivors fell off the back, gasping, weeping, their survival fields collapsing. Lane jumped off, his knees buckling. As he landed, his foot caught a jagged piece of metal, a flap of the torpedo's internal casing. Tick, tick, tick. The impact or the friction had armed the fuse. The digital readout on the nose began a 10-second countdown. "Get back!" Lane screamed. The hangar was full of wounded. The bay doors were jammed half open. If that torpedo blew now, the Bellows was gone. Lane looked at the fleeing pirate ship in the distance, visible through the gap in the doors. He looked at his hands. He kicked the torpedo toward the door, but it was too heavy. He did the only thing a skater could do. He jumped back on. He slammed the throttle to full and aimed the nose at the gap. The torpedo surged forward. Lane intended to jump off at the last second, but his sleeve snagged on a cooling vent. He was dragged out into the void again, clinging to the side of a ticking bomb. He saw the pirate ship growing larger. He saw the timer hit 0:03. With a roar of pure defiance, Lane kicked his legs out, using the momentum of the torpedo to swing himself upward. He unhooked his sleeve, his body flying into a high-arching kickflip through the vacuum. The torpedo struck the pirate's fuel port. A blinding white light consumed the horizon. The pirate ship turned into a second sun. Epilogue: The Legend of the Flubber. Back in the hangar, Everyone stood in silence, looking out at the expanding cloud of debris. Celine whispered, "He's gone." Then, a metallic clink sounded from the rafters. High above the hangar floor, near the emergency pressure seals, a stocky figure was swinging from a hydraulic pipe. Lane dropped down, performing a perfect tuck and roll, before landing flat on his face with a wet thud. "Medic," he wheezed. "Many centuries have passed since the Red Sun era. Technology has moved beyond Ultra. We have become beings of light and thought. But every cadet, whether they come from a nebula of wealth or a moon of poverty, must pass the Lane maneuver. They are given a board and a projectile, and they are told the story of the stocky boy with the ridiculous name. They are taught that high-tech is a tool, but conventional humanity, the ability to improvise, to struggle, and to ride the bombs of life with a smile, is the only thing that keeps the void at bay." Flubber Lane died an old man, surrounded by skateboards and medals. He remains the universe's most tragic comedy, a hero who saved the world because he was too stubborn to let go of the bumper.